Grace, it's great to be together this weekend. I love Dollar Club and what we do over time, and I love specifically this one where we get to help a church across the world or over the border really do what they do in a significant way. So grateful for your involvement in that. And really what you're joining us for this weekend is that sort of conversation, a conversation about what is the global movement of God like, and what does God think about the nations and moving his mission across the world, and like what is that at a big level, and also what does that have to do with you and with me. And my name is Jake. I'm one of the pastors here at Grace and excited to bring kind of week 3 of this conversation. And we've said this is one big sermon over 3 weeks. So if you've missed the first 2 weeks, would encourage you to go back and find those and watch them online or on the app. But if you're here this weekend, you'll be able to get caught up really quickly as to like where we're at and where we're going to wrap up this weekend. But if you have a program, go ahead and flip it to the back. And here's where we've been so far in this series. Here are the things that we've said at a summary level. First, we've said God is over and for all nations. God is over and for all nations. I'll unpack that in a second. And then he's called us to do our part. And so God's over all nations. He's sovereign. He's in control. He's God. Like he is holy and lifted up. He is sovereign and in control. But not only that, he's for all nations. So we see the heart of God in the Bible all the time saying, I care about the nations. I care about my people being a light to the world, like moving outward in such a way where more people who don't yet know me would come to know me for my glory and for their good. So he's over and he's for all nations. And then he's called us to do our part. The way in which God accomplishes his mission is through his people. Over and over and over again, we see that, and this is no different. And so global missions isn't this thing that's like for a small part of the church. In fact, it's for all of us. Anybody who is a believer, we have a part to play in helping God accomplish the mission of moving, again, the gospel across the world. And so we've unpacked that together to ask again, what does it look like for the mission of God, and what does it look like for us to do our part? And this week, we're going to continue that conversation together in some different ways. And to do that, I want to maybe start here. One of the things I love, I don't know that everybody loves these the way I do. In fact, most people, when they talk about these things, they're annoyed by them, but I love commercials. I'm really interested in like how people market things or why they market things. And there's a certain type of commercial that's like my favorite, right? I'll kind of spell it out, how it kind of plays out, and then I'll go from there. So a commercial that's not super uncommon is one where you'll see it like a middle-aged guy or something like that. And you'll see just scenes of him doing things where his life looks pretty great, right? So scene 1 is like him surfing, and he's like smiling while he's surfing, and he's doing a great job, right? Scene 2 is him at a coffee shop. He's got a book open, just looks like a quiet, nice space. Next scene is like him and his son throwing a ball in the backyard. The weather's great. He just looks happy. The next scene is like the boardroom is there, all listening to him where he's giving his presentation at work. So it's like this guy has a great life. Seems like everything he does is positive, is good. And then like you hear the narration over these short little scenes they have, and it'll say something like this. It'll be like, do you want to be the type of person that has flexibility in your life to do the things you want to do? Man, I'm like, yes, sounds great. And then it's like, do you want to be somebody that on vacation, when you pack for that, you don't have to worry about what you pack, and you're just ready to go whenever, wherever that the day might lead? And I'm like, yes, that sounds great. And they'll keep like spelling these things out and showing these pictures, and then they'll get to the end of it, and it'll be like, if that is you, what you need is this over-the-counter dry skin medicine. And it's like, how does that get to there, right? Like, I feel okay about my skin, but if that's what it takes to get to be that guy, like, I'm all in for that. But it's not just like medication. Sometimes it's like a car, right? It's a picture of a family on an adventure. It's like, buy a Kia Sorento, and your family is going to have a blast, right? And this is what commercials do. But it's not just commercials, right? Like, if you go to a conference, right, for your business or something like that, they're going to do this sort of thing where they're going to paint this picture of the person you could be or the way your business could go, or like a better version of the future to try to get you to connect to their product. It happens all the time. They don't even sell their product. They sell a vision of the future that compels you. And why do they do that? They do that because it works. Like for a lot of us, we'll even do this for ourselves. Like New Year's resolution, we'll put this picture of who we want to be out in front of us and go, man, I want to be more like that. Like I want to be that way physically or in my marriage, or I want that sort of a life. And so we put this picture out in front of us. And why do we do that? Here's why I think this happens. That a compelling picture of the future, I think it serves as fuel and a filter for the present. So a compelling picture of the future serves as fuel and a filter for the present. And so if there is this picture in front of you of something you want to become or something you want to create or something you want to achieve either at work or in your family or individually, it actually is fueling for you. right? Like if you've read a book that really resonates with you about something in your life, you like wake up the next day or the next week and you have a little more energy or optimism to get after that part of your life, right? If you have that compelling meeting about your business and where it's gonna go and they give the presentation and it moves you, you're like, that's fueling. Like I want to do my job better to try to accomplish whatever that thing is. And then it's a filter, right? You find yourself changing the things you do in order to accomplish that picture, right? So you wake up at a different time, or you start spending your money in a different way, or you start organizing your thoughts differently. Why? Because you want to accomplish whatever that picture is. And this can be a positive picture or a negative one. One of the ones you heard a lot, I feel like this was more a couple decades ago when this was more common in our culture, was around smoking. You would see like an older person and somebody was talking to them and they would go, don't you want to walk your daughter down the aisle on her wedding day? And then they'd look at that person and say, you gotta change what you're doing now so you can be healthy then. And that picture sometimes in the movie or the show changed that person to go, I do want that. And so I'm gonna change my life now. So if it's compelling enough, here's the deal, we'll go after it. We'll change our habits. We'll like shift our desires, or our desires will have been shifted, and all of a sudden we'll find ourselves going in a different direction. Why do I say that? We've had this conversation for a couple of weeks about the idea of going to the ends of the earth. And if we just zoom out for a second, it's this idea that there is a holy God that has created all things, that is sovereign, like we said, and in control, and he has work for us to do to have more people come to know him. And a question I've been asking myself as I've been thinking through this on like the positive side of the picture is like, what if that works? Like, what if it works? What if more people in your neighborhood, in this city, in this country, and around the world, what if like unreached people groups who don't yet know Jesus, like what if all of a sudden they came to know Jesus? Like what would happen? And I think sometimes our picture of that happening is too small, so we're not like fueled up right now to get after it, or we're not changing things in our life because we don't think about how amazing it would be for more people to connect to Jesus. And so I want to ask us this weekend to lean into this conversation where we're considering like what happens on the other side of the gospel, the good news of Jesus taking root in a person, in a community, and around the world. And so to think about this, I want you to think about this question with me, all right? So what really happens when people submit and surrender to Jesus? What really happens when people submit and surrender to Jesus? It's really important to say this at this point of the message. What I don't mean by this is what happens when more people just claim to be Christians, or more people put that in their social media bios, or more people would say that that's what they're a part of, or even say that they're, quote, religious people. Like, what happens when people submit and surrender their entire life and desires and allegiance to the living God? What changes? Does anything change? Like what changes personally, what changes collectively? And so I want you to think about this in a few different ways. First is this, I want you to think about it individually. What happens when somebody submits and surrenders to Jesus personally? This is often what we think about when we think about Jesus and the gospel moving forward. We think about the idea of people being changed, and we should. And so like what happens there? What happens individually? We should process that in some different ways. The next one is this, what happens communally? So not just with a person, but what happens when like a city or a neighborhood or a team, all of a sudden like Jesus moves not just in a person, but in people in that space, and all of a sudden you see the effects of that. And then lastly, as we're having this conversation in the series, globally. So what happens when individuals start to follow Jesus and then a community starts to rally around the things of God because they're believing in who Jesus says that he is, and then all of a sudden globally you see this movement of God in different spaces. Like what actually happens when people submit and surrender to Jesus? And here's what I'm afraid of sometimes. It's like when we think about this, we just think simply or in a small way, like, hey, there'd be more churches. Like if people submit to Jesus, they'll show up like twice a month and they'll hear some teaching, and like sales of the Bible will probably go up, or downloads of the Bible app, and maybe there's more Christian radio stations around the world. Like if the gospel moves, like maybe there's more Chick-fil-A because that's God's chicken and that goes where the gospel goes. But like, again, what really happens when the living God changes a human soul? And when you see that, again, take root in a community, what happens? You know, something that the Bible talks about a lot that I want to give us as a filter before we go into the Bible here today is one of the things the Bible tells us to be careful of is to be hearers of the word of the Bible and not doers of the word. In fact, it says if you just hear something and don't put it into practice, like that is something you need to be weary of. That is a bad thing. And here's something that can happen in these sorts of conversations. Is I think sometimes we can be convinced but not compelled as it pertains to these sorts of things. We can be convinced and leave like week 1 and week 2 of the series going, yeah, it makes sense. God's over the nations and is for the nations, and you kind of nod your head and you're not disagreeing with what is being said or what the Bible says, but you're not compelled. Like you're not changing something in your life, like your heart's not moved to it, and for some reason we're convinced, but we don't change anything. And the Bible says in James, you have to be very weary of hearing it, but not doing it. So what does it look like for us to have a picture in front of us of like what happens when Jesus changes people in communities so that we can look back and go, I am compelled. Like I'm compelled to be on mission in my space here, but also to the ends of the earth. So what we're gonna do together is to try to look at a picture in the Bible. A picture of a time where there wasn't the gospel in this space, and then all of a sudden there was, and what happened to individuals, but ultimately to the collective group of people, right? So if you have your Bible with you, if you have your phone, turn it on to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. If you're familiar with the setup of the Bible, Acts comes right after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. And so this is right after we see Jesus doing his ministry of living and dying and rising again. And then at the beginning of Acts is where we see this call to the disciples to say, I want you to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So in essence, I want you to care about things beyond your space. And so we see that as a command given by Jesus before he ascends. And then in Acts 2, at the beginning of it, there's this thing called Pentecost. And this was this big religious festival. So people who weren't Christians yet, but people who were religious people came and gathered. And you might have been familiar with the story that God moves in a miraculous way. People start speaking in tongues, and there's people from all over the world. Think the Olympics, all right? Like all over the world in one space coming together, different flags being waved, different languages being spoken. And so the ends of the earth in this conversation are less out there, and they're more all in this one space. And so God moves in a miraculous way. Like I said, people start speaking in different languages, speaking in tongues, and then the people who aren't yet Christians are interacting with that, all right? So they don't know much about this Jesus guy, but he starts to move in their space through Pentecost. And here's what we see in Acts 2, verse 5. Now, they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews. Again, religious people from every nation under heaven. They weren't Christians yet. They were people who were people of Judaism. They were Jewish people. When they heard this sound, again, the speaking in tongues and all that God was doing at the beginning of Acts 2, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. So they were in a space where like, I know these people don't speak this language, but I'm hearing them speak it, and I don't know what to do with it. Next verse says this, they continue to process it. Utterly amazed, they asked, aren't all these people speaking Galilean? Aren't all these people who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? In essence, they don't speak our language. It's like, how in the world are we hearing them in our language? I know they don't speak that. They don't have Duolingo, right? They're not learning our language. They don't know our language, but they're speaking it. Like, what is going on? And they're utterly amazed. It goes on to say this. There's all of these different nations that are listed. I won't read all of these today, but to get this idea of to the ends of the earth in front of us, here are all these different people groups that were gathered there experiencing this. People who didn't have a concept of Jesus, didn't have a concept of forgiveness by virtue of him dying and rising again, all interacting with it. And then it says this at the bottom, if we skip down, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. So all of these people going, what is going on? What do we do with this? What do we do with this? Like, all of a sudden, this living God apparently is doing this, and do we believe this or not? Is this crazy? In fact, the next verse, you see this a little more laid out. Amazed and perplexed, they ask one another, what does this mean? But I love this next part. Some, however, made fun of them and said they have had too much wine. They're like, where's the Jack Daniels? Hold on. Like, this is weird. What's going on? These guys are drunk. Like, this is insane. Like, something crazy is going on, which just reminds us, like where the gospel goes and the good news of Jesus goes, some people are going to be amazed and perplexed. They're going to lean in. They're going to ask questions. Other people are going to go, this is crazy. It's nuts. But you see the crowd going, I don't know what to do with this, amazed and perplexed. And before you write this off as like this was Pentecost and God moved in a way that he like didn't in other times, like this was amazing. It's actually the same formula God uses over all of human history. It's always the power of God through the people of God that he reaches people. He does some things other times, but almost always, power of God through the people of God, and all of a sudden, people start to engage in God. And so they're going, I'm amazed, I'm perplexed. Some going, they're crazy. And quick side note for a second. One of the things that's convicted me about this, and I wonder if some of you will feel this way, is these people were interacting with God for the first time. They were seeing the works of God in front of them for the first time. And you see things like they were amazed. They were perplexed. They were utterly amazed. And sometimes I feel like in me, like over time, the more I see God working, like the less impressed I am or the less I'm like giving him glory for that. Like at first it's like, God answered prayers, that's amazing, he heard me. And now it's like, God's just doing what God does, and all of a sudden, I'm not amazed or perplexed anymore. But these people seeing God for the first time are going, this is incredible. So if you know the story of Acts, this guy Peter gets up and gives a sermon about forgiveness, gives a sermon about Jesus and who he was and dying and rising again, calling them to repentance. Not just to say, I like this Jesus guy, but to turn their life over to him. And so he preaches this whole message. And let's pick it up in Acts 2, verse 40, where we get to the end of it. It says this, with many other words, Peter warned them and he pleaded with them, save yourself from this corrupt generation. Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number in that time. And so we see God move, power of God through the people of God to nations of God that didn't yet know God. And all of a sudden we're seeing people baptized. We see people go, I'm in. And baptism is this expression to say, I'm dying to myself and now I'm living in allegiance to God. And sometimes I think when we think about the picture of the future, it just stops here. Like we go on short-term trips, we have missionaries and some people get baptized and then things just kind of stop there. And again, that's the heartbeat of all of this, like the human soul and the value of it in eternity, but other things come with it. And I want us to read these things together. So Acts 2:42 says this. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. So not only did they get baptized, but all of a sudden they're devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching. What was the apostles' teaching? It was the things that Jesus taught. It was the Old Testament. It was the Bible, and not the way we know it now, but what they had then, and they were teaching that. And so things like love your enemies, things like forgive other people, things like serve instead of trying to be served all the time, things like put others above yourself, things like love Jesus with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. They were learning all of these things and they were devoted to them. So not only were they baptized, they're starting to live on mission for Jesus to glorify him and to bless other people. So they're devoted to that teaching. So you can think a bunch of people who weren't living that way, all of a sudden they're changed and they're going, I'm on mission with Jesus. I'm loving people, I'm serving Jesus, I'm reading my Bible, I'm praying, I'm doing all the things to honor and to love Jesus. And so they're committed to that. And then you see this in the next part of the verse, and to fellowship, and to the breaking of bread and prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. So not only were they listening to teaching, like they found community. One of the things that was true in that time back then is like you were just in the social class you were in. So like if you were born really poor and kind of in that social part of the structure, you would just stay there. Like there wasn't any sort of upward mobility, and so people were where they were in their different subsets of society. And so I picture all the different peoples from different nations, different socioeconomic statuses, different part of the social structure coming together, having everything in common. Going, I have friends. Like I have people to share life with. Like it's the sort of thing we're going, who's hosting tomorrow night? Who's getting the pizza? Where's the movie night out? Where's the Bible study? Like I want to keep coming around. Fellowship, breaking bread, prayer, apostles teaching, a changed community. It goes on to say this, and I love this about them, but about how it would affect the community. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. So talk about like filter and fuel. They're going, I want to change my life, and I have for Jesus so much so that I'm spending money differently. I'm going, hey, I have this house and it's 4 bedrooms. I don't need all the 4 bedrooms. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to get a smaller one so I can give some money away. Like, okay, that person, I saw their car broke down. I know they're struggling right now. Hey, can we pull something together? You can give some, I can give some, I can sell this. All of a sudden, imagine the city going, who are these people who are helping all the time? Like they're constantly going, hey, how can I help and what do you guys need? And they were selling stuff all the time to try to love people around them. It goes on to say this about who they were. Every day they continue to meet together in the temple courts. Like you don't go every day into some space if you don't like the people and what's going on there, right? Like some of y'all have Thanksgiving once a year with some family and you're done after 30 minutes, right? You're like, that's enough of that group for a long time. And they're going, I want to come back tomorrow. Like, I love this. Like, I feel different here. Something is different about what's going on here than anything else in my life. So let's come back tomorrow. What time? 10 o'clock? I'll be there at 9:30. Can I help set up? I'll put down chairs. Like, they want to be in that space because they love what God is doing and how he is moving and living for him. They broke bread in their homes, so not just at the temple courts, they're meeting outside of that, and they ate together, and I love this, with glad and sincere hearts. Man, this whole like to the ends of the earth thing isn't like, let's bring God to the nations so people can just like be mad and follow him and just like be a part of some allegiance. Like, no, it's bringing hope and healing and restoration and purpose and meaning. And these people all of a sudden had glad and sincere hearts because they had experienced the living God. Glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all of the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So starts and ends with this idea of, man, people were meeting Jesus, giving their lives to him, and it was changing everything. Why do we care about to the ends of the earth? Why do we make this effort as a church to go, we want to have external eyes and eternal eyes, and we care about people who aren't yet here and people who don't know Jesus yet? Because at the end of the day, like this will sound like cliche or simple, but we believe like the best thing in the world is God. Like the best thing in the world is a life lived for Jesus. Like more than anything in my life, for me and my wife and my kids, more than anything by far, I want us to love Jesus. Because I think Jesus is like the best thing by a long shot. And you see in this passage, people are going, this is incredible, it's different, it's rich, my life has been changed. Sometimes you'll hear this word thrown around, or these two words, human flourishment. What's the best thing for human flourishment? I think it's more people living in devotion to Jesus. Why? Because ultimately, the God of the universe created you and me, and he knows the right way for us to live. And so, of course, it makes sense that if we live in light of that, if we live in light of who he is, that we would make the most of our life. In fact, we see in this passage not only individuals, but this collective group of people who are not just changed, but transformed by the power and the person of God for the better. And here's what I want to say in kind of summary of this and some language I want to give to what I think is just true about Jesus and spreading the gospel. Here's what I think is true, guys, that making much of Jesus makes the most of life. Making much of Jesus makes the most of life. Believe this to the core of my being. We believe this as a church. The Bible believes, Christians, if you're submitting and surrendering to Jesus, you believe this. Like making much of Jesus makes the most of life. What does it mean to make much of Jesus? To in every aspect of your life, to worship him, to glorify him, to honor him, to submit to him, to surrender to him, to live like he would live. How do you want to make the most of your life? Make much of Jesus. How do you want your neighbor to make most of their life? Make much of Jesus. More than the promotion, more than having more kids, more than those kids even being successful. What makes the most of life? It's making much of Jesus. And the why we care about this, not just to the ends of the earth, but externally eternal eyes, is because we want more people to experience the goodness of Jesus. And the question for you and me to ask is, are we compelled to be doing our part? To love Jesus on our own, but to help others love him and see him as well. So how does making much of Jesus make the most of life? How does that play out? I think in the passage we actually see some different ways in which that's true, ways in which those people were starting to make the most of their life because they were making much of Jesus. The first thing I think is true about what it means for Jesus to grab root of a soul and what changes is this, is it's ultimately hope for the soul. So why is making much of Jesus make the most of life? Because it's hope for the soul. And ultimately, people are in need of hope. I don't think thousands of people would be baptized. I don't think people would have been added to their number every day if they didn't need hope. Because they could have been like, hey, cool sermon, Peter. Love that there's people speaking my language in this weird moment and there's wind and all this stuff, but I'm good. My life feels great. Everything feels solved. But something about the message of the gospel resonates because all of us need hope. And I think we know what it's like to feel like we don't have hope. I remember it was my 7th grade year. I grew up playing basketball. I had 3 older brothers, and so in some ways, when I was growing up, I had just played more basketball than a lot of people around me, simply because it was all we did growing up. And so I got pretty good at it at a young age, and we would play in some tournaments in the local area of Central Ohio. I grew up around here, and I would do decently well in those. So I felt like I had a pretty good kind of grip on the game, and felt like in most games, our team was good to the point where we had a chance to win. But I got onto this AAU team that played at like the level of competition higher than I was at. So instead of like playing just Central Ohio, all of a sudden it was like you're playing in the Midwest and teams from Cincinnati and Detroit and things like that. So I remember my first ever game, if I remember right, that I was on this team playing this competition that was higher, right? This is 7th grade, and I don't know, I'm probably 5'5", I'm maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. Like I'm a small, skinny kid. And so the best I could do was like touch the net, all right? So that gives you just a sense of where I was at athletically, and we were playing against this team from Cincinnati. All right, and they had this kid on their team that I could tell he was an athlete, and he was just like a great player, and I think it was the middle of the first quarter, where I'm already a little nervous because I'm like, man, I don't know that I belong with these guys. Like, I'll just go back to playing in Central Ohio, but I'm just watching them play, and I'm a part of it, and we're doing okay, and then all of a sudden, about 5 minutes into the game, this guy gets the ball on a fast break. He's dribbling down, and I'm kind of watching it happen in front of me, and he just picks it up, and he dunks it. In 7th grade, all right? So you guys watch the NBA or college, and you're like, yeah, people dunk the ball. They don't dunk the ball in 7th grade, all right? Certainly not the teams I was playing. And I remember watching that happen and then just standing there going like, we're toast. I'm like, I don't know why I'm on this team. I don't know what's going on. And we lost by a lot, so we were toast in that particular instance. But I just remember the feeling of seeing that happening, going like, this does not bode well for me. Like, this is not good. But in a serious way, like we've come to that point before in our life where you're like, man, I don't know what to do with this. This doesn't bode well for me. Maybe it's in your marriage where you're like, oh, I don't know how to get through this. Maybe it's just personally where you're like, I feel like I've gotten a lot of the things that I dreamed about, and I still feel kind of empty. Maybe it's just like life in general. You get to a point where you're like, man, it's just not adding up to making me feel like hopeful. Just feel like blah about things. The Bible tells us, like, in different words, in essence, all of us has eternity put in our hearts, that there is something in us that helps us know that there's more to this world than just the things that we can see and touch. And what that does in us, I think, is we can find little bits of hope in small ways, temporary ways, but what we ultimately need is the ultimate hope of the Creator God and the redemption that comes from us no longer living in sin and living in rebellion, but ultimately being saved and born again and forgiven and redeemed. And it's why for thousands of years, millions upon millions of people have gone, man, I want to serve Jesus because I need hope. And the beautiful thing, I talked about baptisms in Acts. We have baptism still today. It's one of the things that's continued as it should in the Christian tradition. And if you've been here for a baptism service, you hear some of those stories. I don't know, but think about it for a second. 3,000 people added to their number who were baptized. Could you imagine the stories that day? The stories of people who are like, I was on my last leg. The stories of people going, I was successful, and I didn't know I needed this until I heard it. But even here at Grace, you'll hear stories like this. Our marriage would not have made it if it wasn't for Jesus. You'll hear stories of people going, I literally tried to commit suicide multiple times, and then I found Jesus, and I have an optimism about life because I know my Heavenly Father is with me. There's stories about people going, I was angry and bitter all the time, and now I'm at peace, and I feel like I'm living a life that's free because Jesus has set me free. And so we just see snippets of these stories, and what are they telling us? That we need hope. And who is the bringer of ultimate hope? It's Jesus. And so why to the ends of the earth? Because making the most of life happens by making much of Jesus, and ultimately there needs to be hope. Our hope in our soul needs to be satisfied in Him, not just for eternity, but also for this life. And it doesn't stop there. It's not just hope for the soul. Second thing I think happens when Jesus is brought to the world, there's ultimately help for needs. There's help for the needs. So again, it's not just they were baptized, it's all of a sudden they're devoted to the apostles' teaching, and a lot of what that looks like is like care for the poor, care about people around you, love your enemies, like try to serve people the way that I have served you. You know, all of us are familiar with the domino effect, right? This idea that there's a domino here, and there's like a line of them, and you hit one domino, and it doesn't stop there. It hits the next one, it hits the next one, it hits the next one, and all of a sudden, a bunch of movement has happened because of one particular domino. I think in some ways, that's what it's like to bring the gospel and Jesus to a part of the world that doesn't have it yet, or a village that doesn't have it yet, or a town or a city or a family that doesn't have it yet. You start to see the trickle effect of that as it pertains to even help for the needs. And I want to share some stats with you guys here today. And I wrestled with this a bit because I don't want this to feel self-serving because it pertains to our church and the way that a lot of you guys have done a great job with this. But I want to share an example of just one local church, and since we have data for Grace, we're going to use Grace, and how we try to help meet needs. And I don't want you to think, yay, Grace in this, even though I hope you're proud of this church. I hope you think about it this way. This is the sort of thing that happens when Jesus people like come together and try to live on mission for him, all right? So here's some things that have been true. Some of these are going to be individual, some of these are going to be collective across our church. There's a couple in our church that volunteers at a ministry in inner city Columbus that helps people who reacclimate after coming out of prison. And so these people who would often have a hard time connecting back to society, of volunteers in this church because they love Jesus, spend their time almost every week loving and serving and helping those people. Since we started Dollar Club about 5 years ago, y'all have given over $680,000 away. Let me give a few examples of what we've given to. There's an earthquake in Haiti in 2022. We gave tens of thousands of dollars to that. There's an organization that helps people get counseling for mental health issues, and they help them do that for people who don't have money to do it, and so we gave to help pay for people's counseling sessions who couldn't have that. We paid for books for a prison library to make sure there was things for them to read in there and some spiritual content as well. We helped provide school uniforms for kids who didn't have the money and families who couldn't afford that, so we helped pay for that for a given school year. We helped families of kids with cancer. Even this weekend, we're helping a church in Mexico replicate all of this. And I could go on and on and on about just the way we're trying to do our best to meet needs around us. Now, as we think about a picture that fuels us, imagine if parts of the world right now that don't have any Jesus there, any of the gospel there, all of a sudden have 10 or 12 or 20 or 30 or hundreds of churches doing the same exact thing. Going, how can we help people who are addicted to drugs get the help that they need? How can we help people who are poor and don't have food to eat get what they need? How can we help people hear about Jesus who right now don't have a space to hear about Jesus? A part of what comes with people who love Jesus is people serving other people. And so one of the beautiful things about bringing Jesus to the ends of the earth is you get help for the needs. Not only help for the soul, which is crucial and foundational, but also help for the needs. And then that transforms into a third thing. When Jesus goes to the ends of the earth and communities understand that, it's hope for the soul, it's hope for the needs, but third, it's this, it's healing for the community. There's not just this individual change, it's sometimes more than just the change of a family, it's a change of a community. There's this verse, we didn't have time to go there in Acts, and I'd encourage you to read the whole book of Acts. I think it's super helpful as we think about to the ends of the earth, but all these people were gathered, as we heard in Acts 2, and then they were scattered and they were persecuted, and different people went to different places. There's this guy, Philip, who went to Samaria, and he shared Jesus with them. And I love Acts 8, verse 8, where all it says is there was great joy in that city. So Philip brought the gospel to Samaria, a place that didn't have it. And they saw a demonstration of God's power, and they were like joyful. They were moved. The community was changed for the positive. I remember, I don't remember exactly what age I was, but at a friend's house who, this was probably elementary school, where they had a garden. And it wasn't a huge garden, but there was some plants and there were some flowers. And so around that, I didn't really know this at the time, there was bees. And I hate bees. I don't know anybody who likes bees, but if you like bees, you scare me. I don't want to be your friend because that just makes me nervous being around bees. I just want nothing to do with them. So I remember that day trying to just swat the bees away. I was trying to kill as many bees as I could. And I remember interacting with the mom of my friend, and they gave me this small and kind but direct lecture about the importance of bees. And they were like, hey, hey, did you know, for gardens, they actually want bees. They bring pollen, and that's good, and sometimes they keep bad things out. And so we're like, hey, you want bees in the garden? And I'm like, I don't care about your garden right now. I just want the bee to go away from me. But what they were saying was there's certain insects or bees or other things that are helpful to this space because they bring good things with them or they keep bad things out. And I actually think it's a decent picture of what it means for the gospel and for Christians to go to places. They bring good things with them, hopefully salt and light and hope, all the things we've talked about and help. And hopefully they keep bad things out in the sense that they're trying to fight sin in their own life. They're caring about injustice and racism and things that aren't healthy and good. They're trying to bring healthy things with them and keep unhealthy things out. And I think Christians do that really well by and large. I know there's not always great examples of that, but I think it's true. And I don't want you to take my word for it. I did some research for this and found two different atheists. People who think Christianity is ridiculous. People who don't believe in it. People who think the Bible's not true. People who don't agree with the things that if you're here and you're a Christian, you and I agree with. But they saw the way that God changes communities for the positive, and they commented on that, all right? So I want to read these quotes to you. The first one's a little long, but it's a guy named Matthew Paris. And he's a part of global efforts to help some things in Africa. And he was a journalist, and so he saw different ways that played out. And it's a little long, but bear with me. I think it's really compelling. Again, atheist. He says this, now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa, sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international change or aid efforts. These alone will not do. Again, atheist. These alone will not do. Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. Far from having cowed or confined its converts, their faith appeared to have liberated and relaxed them. There was a liveliness, a curiosity, an engagement with the world, a directness in their dealings with others that seemed to be missing in traditional African life. They stood tall. Faith does more than support the missionary. It's also transferred to the flock. This is the effect that matters so immensely and of which I cannot help but observe. Only the most severe kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or school and say the world would be better off without it. Again, a guy who disagrees with the claims of Jesus going, I actually hope more communities have Christians go there. Because something uniquely special happens. There's a guy named Richard Dawkins. Some of you may know because he's a staunch atheist. He'll debate different people who go on different news sources and just try to fight against Christianity. But he actually said this. It was fascinating that he did. He called himself a cultural Christian. And he says, it would be truly dreadful to substitute any other religion or worldview in British society in place of Christianity. He calls it a fundamentally decent religion. And then he says, I like to live in a culturally Christian society, although I do not believe a word of the Christian faith. Which part of that doesn't even make sense to me, but part of it goes to show, man, it's not just baptism and salvation. There's something that gets felt and experienced when people start living more like Jesus. You start to see people, again, bring the imago Dei, the image of God with them. And you know what comes with them is every human being matters. And so often what goes with Christian people as they go to parts of the world that don't yet have Christianity or Jesus is women's rights can go up because they weren't cared for. They didn't have the image of God in the way that they understood it. And now we bring with us, or the Christians or Jesus people come and go, you know what? They're made in the image of God and gifted people. And so women's rights go up. You see things like crime often go down in places and spaces where Christians go because they care about serving and loving your enemies. You can see and read a lot of these different things about what it looks like to be healing for communities, for Jesus to be brought to those spaces. Why? Because making much of Jesus makes the most of life. And it's true for you and me individually. It's true for families and neighborhoods. It's true for communities. And so we want to take Jesus to the ends of the earth so we can see people radically transformed and their lives changed. But how are we going to do that? What does it look like for us to actually get busy doing that? In some ways, I want to put the ball back in your court. That our church, really what it is all of you guys. Our church isn't our name or our buildings. It's Christians gathering together, linking arms for the mission of God. And I want to give this to us as maybe a challenge for us and a place for reflection this week. And the last point of your notes is this. Guys, we're never going to take Jesus to the ends of the earth unless we've made him the center of our lives. We're never going to take Jesus to the ends of the earth unless we've made him the center of our lives. unless we're living in this experience of hope and help and healing, I don't blame us for not being compelled. If we're not like in front of Jesus going, man, he is so good in his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness, and I want more of him. If we're not doing that right here, why would we want to take him to the ends of the earth? And so part of the challenge for you and to me is like to stay in front of Jesus to go, man, I want to make sure my whole life is devoted to him. That it does change the way I live my life and spend my mornings and spend my money and orient my family and make goals. It starts with us doing that every moment of every day. And I trust if that happens, we'll be compelled to go to the ends of the earth. So what's our action step in connection to this? It's simple. And in some ways, it's just a call back to the last few weeks as it pertains to what we've given you to do. But here's the action step: to get involved. Get involved. What does it look like for you to try to make a difference in this to the ends of the earth effort? Week 1, we talked about this app you could download that keeps unreached people groups in front of you. That it just shows up on your phone and it helps you know who to pray for and how to pray and what's going on there. Maybe you need to download that or go back and watch that message and download it. Last week we talked about the idea of short-term mission trips and the way that those can fuel our heart to see different spaces and how God is either starting to move or not yet moved, and how that compels us to be a part of that work. Maybe you need to change your finances. Maybe you need to start being more generous in the way you give to a space like this church or to a missionary or a mission organization or something, to say, man, I want my dollars to go, so at the very least I'm invested in a practical way. Whatever it looks like, my encouragement to you would be to get involved. You know, we've mentioned a handful of times throughout the series the idea of short-term trips and the value of those and why we're encouraging you to do those, and I hope you will look online and see how you can get involved. But I couldn't help but think about some of those trips when I thought about this series and even this conversation today. I've been to Kenya 3 times and gotten to see some of like to the ends of the earth play out there. And there's different parts of Kenya that the gospel has really taken root, and there's other parts that are just far off in that country or very like isolated, and we got to experience some of that. And I remember specifically going to this village. We spent our first day in Nairobi, the downtown city there in the slums. And you talk about and think about poverty, it's everything you would think of. It was really hard to just walk there and visualize all that's going on. And then we, a couple days later, went to this village that was hours and hours away, that was just away from anything. And I just saw some of what we're talking about here today play out in such a beautiful way, in a way that's changed my life. Like, I saw families that lived in huts that were the size of most of your living rooms, probably, if that. And it was their whole house. And it wasn't just the husband and the wife and their biological kids. They had adopted kids from the community that were just left on the streets. So some of these huts were full of like 8 people, that it seems like there wasn't even space for a couple. This community had built this school because there in that space of Kenya, if there's a kid who wasn't able to be provided for, the family would just kind of leave them on the street because they weren't able to provide. And again, they don't have the image of God in the same way, but the Christians that were in that community realized they were made in the image of God and they wanted to make a difference. So they built a school and they helped like raise money for that. And ultimately they created a space where those kids could not only be fed, but could learn. And we got to be a part of that and see the way they oriented their community to help. And we got to see the faith of individuals that were struggling to get by, but had such profound faith in the goodness of God and the provision of God that it's, again, changed the way I even understand God, seeing the way they trust in him. But just to see a glimpse of that, the way that community of people loved Jesus so well and was bringing that to that community, it made me go, man, we have to do more of this. We have to do our best to partner with organizations and missionaries and people and do whatever we can to go and to see and to bless and to encourage so that Jesus can be brought to the ends of the earth. But it starts with you and me and our heart going, Jesus, I'll do whatever it takes. I want to stay in front of you and I want to stay on mission with you. So with that in mind, would you just bow your head and close your eyes? I want us to just pray for a moment as we wrap up this series. That I know sometimes these series end and we just go on to the next conversation and maybe it doesn't always take root, but let me just pray that it does for us. Father, first of all, thank you for your heart, that you are a God who's not only over but for all nations. God, you're not only sovereign, but you are long-suffering, that you're patient, that you're merciful, that you're gracious, that we trust wherever the gospel goes, nobody is disqualified from being saved. God, that anybody who turns and repents will be fully forgiven and have hope for eternity, but hope for this life too. They get to bring help and healing. And so God, for our church, for those here today, for myself, God, would you keep your mission for you to be glorified and for people to be reached? Like, would that stay in our soul? Would that stay in our heart? Would that compel us? Not just that we'd be convinced, God, but that we'd be compelled. And it would start with individuals and families, and that we would just link arms with what we're trying to do institutionally with trips and missionaries and whatever's going on, God. Would you help us just be a part of this effort to bring the good news of great joy to more and more people? And God, as we do so, I pray we'd be reminded of the way you're working right now. God, the way that we're seeing you move, the way we're seeing your power, the way we're seeing your glory, your goodness. And would that compel us, God, to love you more in the here and now in this space, but also to get busy bringing you to the ends of the earth. Pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.